So what I'm going to talk about is the interjection of human security into the climate change debate. Why this has happened, what's the evidence that these connections are significant, what the evidence adds up to in terms of the risk facing human societies from these linkages, and the implications for what we should do about it. And then I'm going to conclude with some reflections on the challenges of managing the relationship between the climate change community and the security community. So I want to start with an analogy. The military strategist Bernard Brodie, a professor at Yale University, in 1945, August 6th, picked up the New York Times outside his office and saw the headline. He was, one of the leading military strategists of the day, but not involved in the Manhattan Project, so this surprised him like everyone else. And his first words, according to his biographer, were, "This changes everything. Everything is different now." And so he went about systematically throwing out everything he had done before on military strategy and rethinking from first principles what strategy in the nuclear era was like. It only took him a year to come out with his first thoughts on this. It takes the IPCC 4 years minimum to get anything to print. And he was the first wave of an effort to fundamentally rethink what national security was all about in the nuclear era. And the implications were really quite profound. And the fact that many of those people started that process and got a lot of the key questions right, we owe a lot of debt to, because they did help make the world safer. So my argument is that the current thinking on the impacts of climate change for humans constitute a similarly profound set of transformations in how we think about security in the world. If you read Working Group 2, the report on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability, from cover to cover, which I suspect virtually probably no more than a number of people in this room have actually done. But if you did that, it would be impossible to escape the conclusion that climate change is fundamentally transforming the fabric of human lives across every aspect upon which human societies depend. Livelihoods, food, settlement, culture, identity, home, and so on. And so my argument is that the new understanding of climate change means that when we think about what makes human lives secure, everything really is different now. We can't rely on the old ways of guaranteeing human security. So this is a snapshot of what I think some of the key differences are. The first is that now more and more the fundamental threats to human security are coming from our successes, not our failures. Successes in terms of providing quality of life to people, advances in human longevity, ability to transform natural resources into things of value to people. These are all successes. Making the world a prosperous, bustling place are good things, and it's those good things that have created all these problems. Security problems in the past have largely stemmed from human failures, and it's easier to fix failures than it is to fix successes. The magnitude of these impacts and the pervasive extent of them and the complexity through which they're manifest are also unprecedented. And most depressingly, the things that we're good at are not the things that we need to make use of in fixing these problems. So we wasted a lot of time trying to negotiate treaties to fix the climate change problem. We're relatively good at treaties. We've had a few hundred years of experience. We know how to do this thing. But that tool is not the tool that's going to solve this problem. And because the problems are so different, they're really going to require different kinds of solutions that we have to invent. And in particular, the growing awareness is that the only viable solution to the set of climate impact problems is going to require a fundamental transformation of the way we live our lives. So those are challenges that don't unfold in the course of normal political lifespans. These are generational challenges, and that makes them more difficult. So I'm going to give the briefest of all explanations of why security and climate are now bumping heads. And I tend to make a lot of enemies when I make this first point, but I do it anyway because I believe it's true. The first point is that in the security realm, the dominant trajectory over the last 100 years is one of progress. Although there are exceptions, and the exceptions are tragic, and we're witnessing some of them in the present day, the long trajectory in this issue is that humans have gotten better at containing security breakdowns. And there's a lot of evidence. You can read Steven Pinker's book. If you don't believe his book, there's a lot of other evidence that, this is the case. On the environmental side, it's exactly the mirror image. The experience over the last, certainly 85 years, is the opposite direction. This is a graph showing a whole bunch of different pressures on the environment. They're all getting worse. And they're getting worse in ways that we have not been able to figure out how to contain. So our environmental problems are getting worse much faster than our environmental policy solutions are getting better. It's the mirror image of the security realm. So if you kind of stylize these two trends, you have on the one hand the security community getting more and more confident, getting better, getting willing to take on new challenges, and getting asked to look at new threats because the old threats are getting somewhat more manageable. And on the environmental side, you have people desperate for new solutions and eager to find new allies, form new coalitions, new frameworks for solving these problems because the old ones just aren't working. And so this provides a very logical set of incentives for the security community and the environmental community to come together. So they're engaged in this dance, but they don't quite know what the score to the music is, what the rhythm is, who's supposed to be dancing with whom. And so, we're kind of sorting out the relative roles and responsibilities in this area. And the agenda is very fluid. It hasn't been fixed. You have different people with their ideal agenda. So there are some people who would like to move all the way towards a human security agenda, which puts the fate of people, individuals, and communities right at the center, and the territorial integrity of nation states secondary. Other people don't like that. And they would rather keep the old-fashioned security agenda at the top and make everything else subservient. So you have a very fluid agenda that shifts based on who's talking. But they are talking, and this makes for very interesting developments. So the Security Council the last several years has been taking up climate change as a security threat. This was certainly never envisioned when the UN Charter was formed. It's now routine for U.S. defense establishment assessments to include fairly significant sections on climate change and other environmental threats when they issue their reports. The first time this was done in a major way was in 2009. 10% of the document in this national threat assessment was devoted to environmental threats, most of it around climate change and water. Everyone since then has always included sections on climate change. When Secretary Napolitano retired from head of Department of Homeland Security, in her farewell speech, she went out of her way to say, whoever takes this job next has got to pay a lot of attention to climate change. So climate change is a permanent part of the security landscape. That move has been underfoot for a good 6, 8, even 10 years, you could say. On the flip side, the degree to which security is part of the climate change agenda, you have a relatively more recent manifestation of that. But I would argue that's now here to stay as well. And so the 5th assessment report for the IPCC had an entire chapter on human security. This was requested by member states who are responding to the realization that their responsibility to safeguard the security of their citizens increasingly seemed to depend on what was going on with the climate, and they wanted advice on this. So I was part of the chapter team that tried to make sense of the literature on these questions. These are the kind of headline messages in terms of our conclusions. With respect to aspects of human security that are bound up in people's sense of identity and culture, the existence of communities, we found that the threats were very tangible and immediate, and they were bound to increase. So we have a prospects of ways of life, communities disappearing, if not fundamentally transforming as a consequence of climate change. Many of these threats at the present are being felt primarily in the Arctic, but there's no place on Earth that's immune from this. With migration, even though I think one of the original motivations on the part of the member states was fear of climate refugees, the evidence is much more murky. And so in our chapter, we draw attention to the positive side of migration. Migration is often a pathway towards improvement in livelihoods and well-being, sense of self, and so on. Migration is often an appropriate adaptation to climate change. So it should not be seen always as a negative outcome. In addition, when we looked at the evidence for what kind of threats were going to show up with a migration hook, there's a lot of reason to think that people who are unable to move may be in more danger than people who are forced to move. People who are trapped in place, who don't have the wherewithal to get out of harm's way, or who are blocked because of political barriers from relocating. There is a threat that people who will be forced to move because of climate shocks will suffer, but it needs to be taken into account of with regard to the overall context. With armed conflict, we find lots of compelling reasons to think there will be more armed conflict in a climate change world. The drivers of conflict will get worse, for example, livelihoods, and there's more statistical evidence that the risk of armed conflict goes up when the climate gets weird. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. This is just a summary of some of the recent statistical research, which collects a range of studies that, using different methods, different data sources, different outcomes, finds a consistent pattern that when human societies experience unusual weather, the risk of some form of organized violence goes up. So what are the implications? We're still, as a community, we have not come up with a definitive answer to this. So I'm going to give you my own take on this. I think the biggest implication that comes from the realization that climate change threatens human security through a variety of pathways cements the proposition that the best way to think about what to do about climate change and what it's going to do to us is through an analytical perspective of risk. 20 years ago, when people started trying to make sense of climate impacts, they tended to focus on costs and benefits. What's the aggregate cost of climate change to human society? And they would denominate these things as percentages of GDP. And then they would look at the cost of mitigating climate change, and they would compare these things. That debate turned out not to be very helpful. And so the new approach, which is embraced in the latest IPCC report, is that society should be thinking about risks. Many of these risks can't be quantified in terms of specific costs and benefits, but they're things that societies care deeply about. And so the expert community has an obligation to help societies understand what these risks are so that they can make choices about them. And that means you have to pay attention to rare events, remote possibilities that would have big impacts on people. And you have to help people choose pathways that will navigate across these alternative risk landscapes in ways that will make them feel more secure, not less secure. And that's a very, very difficult task, and you have to do it, with the entire planet on board. We don't yet know how to do that. Negotiating treaties is not the way to achieve this kind of outcome. It has to be much more broad-based, much more communication strategies involved, and much more intricate networks of different communities figuring out how to understand and communicate these things. We have conquered comparable threats in the past. I list two examples up here. The transition from a full free market economy, which we suffered through at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. We got out of that trap, and we now live in an era in which we regulate the extremes of the market. It was very difficult to do that. It took a couple of generations, but we did it. I would argue the transition from a full self-help system in the security realm to the current system in which collective security has a dominant function is another example. The Choose Your Adventure book is an allusion to the point that we have to choose the future that we want. And this is not choosing an endpoint. It's not choosing, how many degrees centigrade increase we'll live through. It's not choosing what kind of carbon tax we'll have. It's choosing an entire pathway through this realm. And so, finally, I want to talk about how the security and climate change community get along. And they get along fitfully, frankly. And there's lots of evidence that they don't get along well at all. And I put some headlines up here. You can frequently see people screaming and shouting at each other, calling each other idiots. And I think that that's okay. I think it's like a fractious marriage that has some solid basis underneath it. But we can't go on like this forever. And if we distrust each other, if we suspect each other's motives forever, we won't be able to deepen the arrangement. And so I think what the solution here is to have deeper, ongoing, lasting networks that socialize the different communities to each other and unite people towards a common endeavor which has in mind helping societies understand these risks and navigate pathways around them. And I think at root, we share those goals, but we come at the question from such disparate starting points that it's sometimes easy to lapse into these petty squabbles. And the more you see these squabbles, the more it's a sign we're doing something wrong, and as they fade away, it means we'll have been doing something right. Thanks.